Well, yes, indeed, that is what we'll be focusing on today. As you may have seen in that welcoming slide, Professor Pat Utomi joins us now. He's an economist, policy strategist, policy analyst. He's also the founder of Center for Values in Leadership. Good morning, Prof. Thank you for joining us today on the program.
It's a pleasure.
Well, we do know that at the time that they announced the closure of all land borders, there were several reactions from different quarters. So now the committee, they just spoke about that yesterday. 4 of those land borders have been reopened, and then the others, they've given the dates wherein the reopening will occur. What are your immediate impressions about the opening of these 4 at the moment? Okay, so we're going to try and reestablish that. It seems I've lost Prof there. But just as I did put out there, well, you remember at the time, lots of reactions. The LCCI, Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry, NASI, several economic groups. But, it was actually different strokes for different folks, really, because several people thought, okay, because at that time, they were not too clear concerning the reasons other than the ones which you heard. And so they were a little confusing concerning why. All of them, don't forget, it was all land borders, but the ones, the prominent ones, of course, the economic hub, Lagos, Seme, so lots of things happened through there. Remember, several countries came into the country to try and, have that jaw with that country, to let them see reason why they thought, well, there are certain laws that they thought we were overlooking by insisting on going that route. But as it is now, it appears as though we are just looking to see what to do moving forward.
That law, especially the law as concerning the ECOWAS, free trade agreement and all of that. So, which of course makes a world of sense. When all the borders were closed, part of the reasons given were to check illegal arms proliferation, to check smuggling of rice and other products that are undermining local production in Nigeria, to reduce smuggling of various other things, just as we mentioned, especially rice, which is one of those things and all. But I think a number of things that so many other people have, talked about is, look, there are many things in the value chain. Even if you want to produce within your own borders, you want to produce, from home, there are many, many things to look at. For instance, I remember that back in time, even now, importation of poultry has reduced significantly. But then the poultry farmers themselves, so I'm getting there now. The poultry farmers themselves are saying, okay, well, we can produce more. How about the feeds? Okay, how about the feeds that will help them produce more poultry? So there are certain things or part of their feeds that we don't produce. For instance, we don't produce the vaccines that they give some of these chickens and some of the poultry and all of that. So that's one, is there. So many other things. Well, when one looks at all of the issues, all of the contentious issues around this thing, how significantly have those been dealt with is something that one would really expect the authorities to speak to. Well, hopefully we'll be able to get them one of these days, because when we heard that the borders are going to be reopened, the question we're asking is, arms proliferation, has it reduced? Has it been dealt with? What's the assurance that we're not going to get back there again? Illegal influx of foreigners into Nigeria, is the immigration service now so well kitted that we're not going to go back to that? Illegal proliferation of firearms, customs and all. Are we there now? Are we so standardized that those things are not going to happen again? We're not going to go back to that? Those questions need answering.
Well, let's get back to Prof. He's on the line now. Prof, sorry about that. We're just trying to see how we could get the best of connections via whichever means, but at least we do have something. Well, I need to ask you, what are were your immediate reactions when you learned that these 4 borders have been reopened as announced by the government?
Well, my reaction was about time. I think that the whole policy was wrong-headed from the very beginning. We have been described as a recursive economy because we cannot seem to work consistently down one track. Let me go back a little bit. Back in the 80s, Nigeria's economic development was severely challenged. I mean, sadly, even as recently as 2019, the Forbes article, May 28, 2019, which referred to Nigeria as Africa's money-losing machine, went back to a comparison that I sadly used to make with Venezuela. Back in the 80s, the economy that would look best like was Venezuela is. And bear in mind that Venezuela is sitting on perhaps the biggest crude oil reserve that there is in the world, and yet they are where they are. And that's where we were in 1984, until policies began to loosen up about 86 coming forward. A lot of mistakes were made in the adjustment policies, but it saved us from queuing up on the streets of Nigeria to buy salt and sugar. I mean, a lot of young people may not quite completely understand this, but in the 1980s, we had to set up a company called the National Supply Company just to ensure that we got milk and sugar. And people used to have long queues to buy milk and sugar in Nigeria with all the so-called oil money and all of that. Now, when we began to then loosen up and to look at how to do things differently, Nigeria held its first economic summit, National Economic Summit. I think it was about 1994 when Chivenes Shunekon was head of government. And we had a presentation of scenarios on how Nigeria could travel. And one of the scenarios that came out of a team from the biggest, best-known scenario planning group in the world that I know of at that time, from Shell, was a presentation of between open borders and closed borders. And the conclusion was what everybody hailed as TINA. TINA is there is no alternative. You can choose autarky and punish your people behind your closed walls, or you can look at your comparative advantage and emphasize them in exchange, in trade with other people, and create wealth and create growth in your country and a better life for everybody. It is the most short-sighted thing to rush into an autarkic situation. We saw it fail China for a long time. Albania is a classic example of it, until China got the good fortune of measuring its engagement under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, and we now have the China that we have today. Now, in our own situation, there is no doubt that there can be challenges with completely open borders if you don't do a few things right. Even as we speak, Paul Krugman, the 2008 Nobel Prize winner in economics, who were those who pushed for open trade and all of that? Recently, in the last few months, Krugman has been known to query whether America fully got the benefit of complete openness under the face of the Trump pushback. And part of my hope is that we'll get Paul Krugman to speak at the next CVL annual lecture on the 5th of February here in Lagos. We're in touch with him, and we want him to reflect on some of the rethinking he's doing around trade. But there is no doubt that prosperity, greater prosperity, has come from trade. And that if we look at issues of our borders being porous and things coming from other destinations and ending up, the rules of origin that are important, we cannot be signing an ACFTA, African Continental Free Trade Agreement, on the one hand, and saying, the only way we can prosper is by closing our borders.
So, Prof, if I could jump in there for a bit,
Yes.
some of those who spoke in support of the land border closure. I mean, we just played the tapes of some of them, including those who deal in those businesses directly, the rice farmers, the poultry farmers, and several others. They say that, look, they had seen improved yields and then the economy was a lot better. So what do we do with those perspectives of theirs concerning why they thought that the closure benefited them?
Pretty fair point. Pretty fair point. What you do is you have targeted industrial policy. Now, in today's structural economics, that is referred to as latent comparative advantage, playing your latent comparative advantage. This means that you look at your factor endowments and you say, we can expect that in 5 years, if we protected this particular industry, not a blanket kind of thing that we did under import substitution industrialization that led us to having permanent infant industries. If we look at our endowment in, say, sesame seeds, and we realize that if we did the needful, within 5 years, we would be globally competitive in the production, processing, and export of sesame seeds, that we can fit into global value chains and dominate those value chains, then we can use industrial policy to ensure that over that 5-year period, we give enough protection to that industry. A blanket closure of your border can only do you more damage. So those people who say it did them good, are we really truly competitive in those areas?
Okay, so Prof,
and we find that we can be competitive, then we can use that industrial policy to support them.
So when you say blanket closure may not do us any good, are you suggesting some form of closure other than the approach that we took initially? And what will they be?
That's the point I'm making, that if there is a particular endowment, if we say rice, let's take rice, the famous rice.
Okay.
We can show that if we did the needful, in 5 years we will be competitive even in exporting rice. Then we can say rice, for 5 years, nothing. And in those 5 years, we must do everything that it takes to become as competitive on rice production and export. Part of the problem that we have had is that people can then hide behind tariff walls, not do the needful, we don't become competitive, and we get the permanent infant industry thing, where people can only make any progress if you give them this barrier that makes you uncompetitive. Then you punish the local consumer who pays much, much, much more for something that he could get cheaper if you did what you can do best and exported those and imported the thing that you are forcing them to buy without making the appropriate investment.
So, Prof,
locally.
because part of the narrative they put out yesterday, which the Daily is even referred to this morning, I mean, the front page of some of them, which we reviewed, did say rice, poultry importation remains banned as these borders are open. So, are we getting it right in that regard?
And let's be sure that the decision is based on our calculating that we can become competitive and not on some pressure group wanting advantage. Because if that is the case, then we are punishing the local consumer in the interest of those people who will never get us to where we should be.
Perhaps another question on that.
If that were the case.
Pardon me, Prof.
If we've done some study and we're convinced.
Yeah, pardon me, Prof. Perhaps the challenge there would be in the capacity of the local producers to be sure that indeed that they can fund or supply enough to sustain our needs. For instance, rice that still remains banned. It's this significant challenge of getting them and the costs as they come in the market. Same goes for poultry. So what do you think needs to be done to ensure that the ban on rice and the ban on the importation of poultry products is significant enough to help the local producers themselves so that they can meet the local demands of the people?
Fantastic question. Because you see, part of the trouble that we have had is the failure of policy in Nigeria to be consistent on anything. the South Korean economist at Cambridge, Jeju Chang, who wrote the book Bad Samaritans, keeps prescribing that approach, which is what works for South Korea that got it to where it became globally competitive. There is some logic to it up to a point. The problem is that we've not been able to have the discipline to do it the way that PAC, for example, did it in South Korea. Now, if you were going to run that policy, it's not that you make some pronouncement, okay, we'll protect the poultry industry for 5 years and blah, 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 and then you go off and you, the minister, your friend wants to smuggle some in, you will, on the side, write him a waiver. Because Nigeria is an economy of waivers because of the indiscipline of the political class. What we must do, if we agree that we can become competitive on this particular track and that it will take us 5 years to so do, is like PAC, as a South Korean president would do in those days, say, okay, who are all the stakeholders in this area? Let's sit down on this table. What will it take for you to become an exporter of poultry from Nigeria 6 years from now? And the poultry farmers will say, we need bank money at no more than 1% interest, for example. Then he will say to the bankers, what will it take for you to give them this money at 1% interest? And the bankers will say, all government money may have to be deposited at 0 interest in our banks to support this. And then he will say to the stakeholders will all agree on what they must do. And they must, in a disciplined way, follow that. It's not that you go and announce tomorrow, central bank is now going to release 20 billion. Hey, everybody claps. And the farmers are saying to you every day, we've not seen one kobo. We've not seen one kobo. Middlemen, politicians will capture the money in between. The problem of Nigeria's economic development is simple. One word: discipline. The leadership of Nigeria has not had the discipline to build an economy. That is the problem.
Well, Prof, there are two policies that you can speak to very, very quickly. How well we are doing with those policies in championing these issues that you have raised. One of them is the Anchor Borrowers Program of the CBN, and the other is the Economic Sustainability Plan, especially the AMBIT, that talks about scaling up agricultural production and all of that. How significant do you see that in dealing with this issue we're talking about?
Let me just put it straight to you. I run an integrated agriculture and agri-industrial town. I'm building one up. I still have not received one kobo from any government or non-government. We're putting literally billions into this. You will get stories. Let me tell you how silly it gets. One bank, the bank I know very well, that my friends said to us, but you see this your location in Edo State, there's a lot of armed robbery around the place. I mean, this is the kind of nonsense you hear from the system. So it's not enough to make announcements. It's not working. Let's be honest, that's not what Korea did. I just explained how PAC worked the process and what made it work in South Korea. So these policies are all announcement policies. It seems that the whole idea is to have an announcement effect because we're not seeing it on ground.
So you don't think that the announcement... My apologies.
Policy analysts.
My apologies, Prof. You don't think that all those claims made by the CBN governor is correct? That, there are poultry farmers that are smiling?
They have made the policy. The question is, did it get to the people? He's not going to go and put it down himself and go and find the people. The governor is my friend. I've talked to him about this several times. I still don't have 1 naira.
Where do you think the problem lies then?
Sorry?
Where do you think the problem lies?
There's too much, I don't know. Nigeria's problem is the triumph of politics. It's too much politics, too much, we keep using this excuse implementation, but that does not wash with me because, as a scholar of the policy process, I can tell you that anything that you pronounce that doesn't get implemented is because you didn't take the problems of implementation into account when you were making the pronouncement. A guy called Jeffrey Pressman wrote a book on this back in the 1980s. Policy implementation is really about dirtying the hands. Who are the people on ground? What are the bottlenecks? How do we debottleneck those things? How do we get those things functioning? That's what the problem is.
Okay. Well, Prof, there is one other dirty in that perhaps need to do here. So some borders have been opened, 4 of them basically. But the major challenge a number of people have posited is the kind of conversation we should have or are not having with the border communities themselves. There is that claim that they aid and abet smuggling and all of that. What kind of communication should we be having with border communities that we may have not heard that will help us to sustain the gains, if any, of the border closure that lasted until yesterday?
You know, again, that is part of the point about policy. When you're making a policy, you have to ask yourself what truly is implementable. Look at the hundreds of thousands of miles of Nigeria's border. In many of those places, they don't actually know that it's a border. The people who live in those communities cross the border 50 times a day without knowing. In fact, their toilets may be in the other country, and their living room is in Nigeria. So policing those borders, you cannot get 100% effectiveness. So you got to look at what are you trying to keep out? What is necessary to aim to keep out? How do those things travel? I tell you, many years ago, I went to Ghana, and it was this kind of season of the year, and there was Hamatan, and my flight could not land Lagos. And I was very anxious to be in Lagos that day for some program the following day. So I hired a car from Accra to start driving to Lagos late in the afternoon. We crossed the border around 10 or 9 p.m. or something similar. I mean, it was like all the trailers in the entire world were heading to Lagos.
Oh dear.
Yes, and within 50 meters of each other, you are at one checkpoint, you are seeing the next checkpoint. So there's total complicity with the authorities. Immigration, customs, they're all complicit.
And Prof, that point you made, I mean, we've talked about this even right from the first day, even up until today. We don't know what measures have been taken for those officials who are supposed to man these borders to ensure these things don't happen. Now we've announced reopening. What's the guarantee that, look, it won't be business as usual if they wanted to prevent anything?
Well, I think we need to probably re-educate our whole system. Look, the average guy who's joining the customs is looking to go, quote-unquote, unfortunately, go and make hay. We need to be able to do a total reorientation program. Look, these are human beings. If they learn enough the damage that these things are doing to their country, the possibilities of their children prospering tomorrow, the short-term thinking of, I collect this bribe, I build 2 houses, maybe we can begin to get a reorientation. It's not a joking matter. You can use force. We sack these people. The next one is coming and looking for a fresher way to carry out the same thing. We just got to do a national orientation thing around many of these things. Because in the end, we end up losing. We think we're winning now as individuals, but all of us lose in the end when all this violence all over the place, caused largely by poverty, come upon us. All those things that we have stolen or taken from bribe comes back to haunt all of us. So I don't know what the national orientation, Dr. Garba Barry is a nice guy, but I don't know how much they are doing. Our country needs a total reorientation. If you tell me that, because my friend Hamid Ali is making noise, that the customs troops are working a different work, he's deceiving himself. Half of the guys who applied to go and make hay.
Wow.
You don't fire this guy, fire that guy if you can even, and everything is right. No, we need a total, inside-out cleanup
Well, it's
educating people, running continuous development programs for them, leadership training, and all of that to understand really their mission.
yeah. Well, Prof, we
make those small connects. They're going
all
to
right,
go around in circles.
we appreciate your time and your perspectives on the program this morning. Always a pleasure to have you on. Thank you for talking to us this morning, Prof.
Great pleasure, Chamberlain.